Sarah's knees hit the dirt behind the livery stable, and she didn't have the strength to stand back up. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, like it was angry at the world before it even arrived. She pressed both hands to her swollen belly and tried to remember the last time she'd eaten something that wasn't stolen. 3 days ago, she'd walked away from the last town that would have her. Before that, another town and another. Each one smaller, meaner, quicker to shut their doors when they saw her condition and the absence of a ring on her finger. The desert between settlements had nearly finished what shame and hunger had started. Her boots were splitting at the seams. Her dress hung loose everywhere except where the baby pushed it out, and the fabric was so caked with dust it might have been brown originally or gray or even blue. She couldn't remember anymore. The sun was setting over Copperhill, painting the wooden buildings in shades of rust and amber. From where she knelt in the dirt, she could hear the sounds of evening settling in. A dog barking, someone hammering at the blacksmith's forge, the creak of wagon wheels on the main road, normal sounds, the kind of sounds that belonged to people who had places to sleep and reasons to wake up in the morning. She should move, find somewhere to curl up for the night before full dark came and brought the cold with it. But her body wouldn't cooperate. Everything hurt. Her back, her feet, the constant ache low in her spine that the midwife back in Tallridge had warned her about before running Sarah out of town with the rest of the righteous folks. "You planning to sleep there, or you just praying?" Sarah's head snapped up. A man stood at the corner of the livery, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat tipped back far enough that she could see his face in the failing light. He wasn't old, maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to tell with men who worked outdoors. His shirt was dusty, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he held a pair of worn leather reins in one hand. She tried to stand, got halfway up, and her vision swam. The ground tilted. His hand caught her elbow before she went down completely. "Easy." His voice was rough but not unkind. "When you last eat." Sarah pulled her arm back, stumbling a step away from him. "I'm fine." "Sure you are." He didn't move closer, just studied her with eyes that had probably seen plenty of liars in his time. "Where you headed?" "West. West is a big place." She lifted her chin, trying to find some scrap of dignity in the ruins of herself. "I'll manage." In that condition, he gestured at her belly without quite looking at it directly, the way men did when they were uncomfortable. "You won't make it another 10 miles. "Then I'll make it 9. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, not quite respect, but something in that territory. He turned and looked back toward the main street, then at her again. "I got a ranch about an hour's ride north. I need help with the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending, works hard, but there's a bed and 3 meals." Sarah's heart hammered against her chest. She'd heard offers like this before. Sometimes they were genuine, sometimes they weren't. "What kind of help?" "The kind I just said." He met her eyes, steady and direct. "I'm not interested in anything else, if that's what you're thinking. My wife died 2 years back. House has been falling apart since. I can't pay much, but you'll have a roof and food." The baby kicked again, harder. Sarah's hands moved to her stomach without her permission. "Why me?" "Because you're here, and you're desperate, and I'm tired of living in dirt." He shrugged. "And because you look like you could use a stroke of luck." She wanted to say no, wanted to walk away from this stranger and his convenient offer and his ranch an hour north of nowhere. But her body was screaming at her, and the baby was screaming louder, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her anything without expecting her to pay for it with pieces of herself. 1 month, she heard herself say, trial period. "Fair enough." He held out his hand. "Jacob Mercer." She looked at his hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was calloused and warm. "Sarah." "Just Sarah. Just Sarah." He nodded like that was answer enough. "Got a horse tied up front. You can ride behind me." The ranch wasn't what she expected. She'd been imagining something rough and barely standing, but Jacob's place was solid. The house was 2 stories, painted white once upon a time, with a wraparound porch that sagged a little on the north end. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several corrals holding cattle that lowed softly in the darkness. Lantern lights spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. Jacob dismounted first, then helped her down with careful hands that didn't linger. "I'll show you your room." Inside, the house smelled like dust and old coffee and something else, the particular emptiness of a place where someone used to live but didn't anymore. The furniture was good quality but neglected. Dishes piled in the dry sink, mud tracked across the floor, a woman's shawl hung on a hook by the door, faded and forgotten. Her room was upstairs, small but clean, with a bed that had actual sheets and a window facing east. Sarah stood in the doorway and felt something crack open in her chest. "Washrooms down the hall," Jacob said from behind her. "I'll bring up some water. You hungry?" She was so hungry she felt hollow. "Yes. I'll see what I can find." He left her there, his boots heavy on the stairs. Sarah sank onto the bed and pressed both hands to her face. She wouldn't cry. She'd given up crying somewhere back in the territory after the fourth town ran her out. But her shoulders shook anyway, silent and hard, and the baby rolled inside her like it understood. The next morning started before dawn. Sarah woke to the sound of Jacob moving around downstairs, the clink of a coffee pot, the scrape of a chair. She'd slept harder than she had in months, and her body ached in new ways from the softness of the mattress. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with his back to her. "Coffee's hot," he said without turning. "Bread's in the box, eggs if you want them." They ate in silence, the kind that felt less awkward than it should have. He showed her where things were, the pantry, the root cellar, the mending basket that overflowed with shirts that needed buttons and pants with blown knees. The list of work was endless. "I'll be out with the herd most days," he said. "Back by sundown unless there's trouble. You need something, there's a bell on the porch. Ring it and I'll hear." Sarah nodded. "What about town? What about it? Do they know I'm here?" Jacob poured himself more coffee, slow and deliberate. "They will eventually. Small place, people talk. And when they do." He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes moving over her face like he was trying to understand what kind of person stood in his kitchen. "Then they talk, won't be the first time. You don't care what they'll say." "I care about keeping my ranch running." He set his cup down. "What they say in town doesn't feed my cattle." It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something. Sarah watched him pull on his hat and walk out into the blue dawn, and she felt the weight of the decision he'd made settling around both of them like dust. The days fell into a rhythm. Sarah cleaned, cooked, mended, and tried not to think about the fact that her belly grew bigger every week. Jacob worked, came home tired, ate whatever she'd made without complaint, and disappeared into his room or the barn. They didn't talk much beyond what was necessary. "Where's the flour? Fences down in the south pasture. Storm coming in tomorrow." But slowly, in the spaces between words, something else grew. She learned that he took his coffee black and hated beans, that he'd built the barn himself after the old one burned, that his wife had been named Anna, and he kept her things exactly where she'd left them because he didn't know what else to do with them. He learned that Sarah had been a teacher once, in a town so far east it felt like a different world, that the baby's father was a man who'd made promises he never intended to keep, that she hadn't spoken to her family in over a year because they'd made their position on unwed mothers very clear. One evening, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, Jacob came in from the barn and found her crying at the kitchen table. Not the quiet kind of crying, the kind that shook her whole body, raw and ugly and beyond her control. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her, said nothing, and waited. "I don't know how to do this," she finally gasped out. "The baby, alone, I don't know anything about being a mother." "Nobody does," he said quietly, "not at first. Your wife probably did." Anna was terrified. He smiled, small and sad. Cried for a week straight when she found out she was expecting. Then she lost it 3 months in, and we never got another chance. Sarah wiped her face with her sleeve. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stood, walked to the stove, and poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her. "You'll figure it out. People always do." "What if I can't?" Then you'll figure that out too. It wasn't reassurance exactly, but it was honest, and honesty was something she could hold on to. The town found out in August. Sarah had been at the ranch almost 3 months, and her belly was too big to hide under shawls and loose dresses anymore. Jacob needed supplies, and she was out of flour, so they went together in the wagon, her first trip back to Copperhill since he'd found her behind the livery. People stared, she'd expected that, but what she hadn't expected was the way they looked at Jacob. Speculation, judgment, the kind of whispers that carried across the general store like wind. That's bold, Jacob, taking in a woman like that. Wonder whose baby it is. Poor Anna must be turning in her grave. Jacob bought what they needed, paid without comment, and helped Sarah back into the wagon. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. They rode home in silence. That night he didn't come in for dinner. Sarah ate alone, listening to the sound of him working in the barn long after dark. When she finally went out to check on him, she found him sitting on a hay bale, his head in his hands. "I'm making your life harder," she said from the doorway. No, he didn't look up. "They're making my life harder, you're just living yours. I can leave, find somewhere else." Where? Now he did look up, and his eyes were fierce. "Where are you going to go, Sarah? What town is going to take you in 8 months pregnant with winter coming?" She didn't have an answer. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't care what they think." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she meant it. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Jacob stood, crossed the barn, and stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunsets. "Because someone should," he said simply, "and because this ranch has been dead since Anna left. You brought something back to it, something I didn't know I needed." Sarah's breath caught. "Jacob." "I'm not asking you for anything," he interrupted. "I'm just telling you why you're staying." The baby was born on a cold night in October, 3 weeks earlier than Sarah expected. The midwife from town refused to come, so Jacob rode through the dark to fetch a widow named Mrs. Garrett from a neighboring ranch. She was 70 if she was a day, with hands like tree roots and a voice that could cut through pain. Sarah labored for 14 hours. Jacob stayed in the hallway outside her room, packing and praying and probably cursing himself for every decision that had led to this moment. When the baby finally came, a girl with dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, Mrs. Garrett cleaned her up, wrapped her tight, and handed her to Sarah with a knowing look. "She's healthy, that's what matters." Sarah held her daughter and felt the last piece of her old life fall away. Everything before this moment was just noise. This was real. This tiny, screaming, perfect thing was real. Jacob appeared in the doorway, hesitant and exhausted. "Can I?" Sarah nodded. He came closer, looked down at the baby, and something in his expression shifted, softened. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "Her name is Grace." "That's a good name." Mrs. Garrett left at dawn with instructions and payment and a warning to Jacob that raising a baby wasn't ranch work. He nodded solemnly, like she'd told him something he didn't already know. The first weeks were chaos. Grace cried at all hours. Sarah was exhausted and sore and terrified she was doing everything wrong. Jacob helped in ways she didn't expect, holding the baby while Sarah slept, heating water for washing, sitting up with her during the worst nights when Grace wouldn't settle. One night, after Grace finally fell asleep, Sarah found Jacob in the kitchen making coffee at 2 in the morning. She sat down across from him, and they stared at each other like survivors of the same disaster. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't," he rubbed his face. "I'm not doing anything special." "You're doing everything." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, something that had been building for months, since that first night behind the livery. Something neither of them had named yet, because naming it felt dangerous. "Sarah," he started. The sound of horses cut him off, multiple horses moving fast. Coming up the road from town, Jacob stood, his hand going to the rifle mounted above the door. "Stay here." But Sarah followed him onto the porch, her heart pounding. 4 men sat on horseback in the yard, their faces hard in the moonlight. She recognized one of them, the marshal from Copperhill, a man named Wade with a reputation for cruelty disguised as law. "Evening, Jacob," Wade said. He didn't dismount. "We need to talk about your situation here." "What situation?" "The woman and the baby." Wade gestured at Sarah with his chin. "Got complaints from town. Decent folks don't want that kind of element so close." Jacob's voice went cold. "That kind of element. You know what I mean. Unwed mother, no family, no history. For all we know, she's running from something. Could bring trouble down on all of us. The only trouble I see is you 4 on my property, uninvited." "Now, Jacob, don't be foolish." Wade's hand rested on his pistol. "I'm trying to help you. You send her on her way, and this all goes away. No one has to know you were soft-hearted for a spell." Sarah felt ice in her veins. She'd known this was coming, had been waiting for it since the day she arrived. Towns always protected themselves eventually, always pushed out the broken ones. But Jacob stepped forward, putting himself between her and the horses. "She's not going anywhere. You willing to stake your reputation on that? You're standing in this town." "I'm willing to stake whatever it takes." Jacob's hand didn't move toward the rifle, but his body was coiled tight, ready. "Now get off my land." Wade studied him for a long moment, then he spat into the dirt. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be my first." The men turned their horses and rode back toward town, slow and deliberate, like they wanted Jacob to reconsider. When they were gone, Sarah found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that." "Yes, I should have." He turned to face her, and his eyes held something fierce and final. "I'm tired of being alone in this house. I'm tired of pretending I don't care what happens to you, and I'm tired of letting other people decide what's right for my life." "Jacob, marry me." The words hung in the cold air between them. Sarah's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "I know it's not romantic," he continued, his voice rough. "I know you didn't come here looking for this, but Grace needs a father and I need—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I need you to stay, not as hired help, as my wife." "You don't have to do this," Sarah said. "You don't owe me anything." "This isn't about owing." He took a step closer. "I'm asking because somewhere between the day I found you behind that livery and tonight, I stopped being able to imagine this place without you in it." Sarah's eyes burned. "I don't love you." "I know," he smiled, small and sad, "but maybe someday you could." She thought about the months behind them, the quiet mornings, the shared work, the way he'd stayed up with her when Grace was born, looking at the baby like she was a miracle instead of a burden, the way he'd stood between her and the marshal without hesitation. "Maybe," she whispered. "That's enough for me." They were married by Mrs. Garrett in the ranch house kitchen 2 days later, with Grace sleeping in a basket and no guests beyond the old woman. It wasn't the wedding Sarah had imagined as a girl. There were no flowers, no music, no family, just 2 people making a promise they both hoped they could keep. That night, Jacob moved his things into the guest room downstairs without being asked. "Take your time," he said. "This doesn't have to be anything you're not ready for." Sarah nodded, grateful and confused, and terrified of the kindness in his voice. The winter came hard. Snow piled against the doors, and the wind howled through gaps in the walls Jacob hadn't gotten around to fixing. They fell into a new rhythm, this time as husband and wife. He taught her to shoot so she could protect herself when he was out with the cattle. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed silence and when he needed company. Grace grew. She smiled for the first time in January, and Jacob was there to see it. He held her like she was made of glass, this man who wrestled steers and built fences with his bare hands. One night in February, Sarah found him asleep in the rocking chair with Grace on his chest, both of them breathing in sync. She stood in the doorway and felt something crack open inside her, the same thing that had cracked that first night when he'd given her a room and asked for nothing. Love, she realized, didn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it came slow, like dawn, so gradual you didn't notice, until the world was already bright. She crossed the room and touched his shoulder gently. He woke, disoriented, then smiled when he saw her. "Sorry, didn't mean to fall asleep." "Don't apologize." She took Grace carefully, settled the baby in her cradle, and turned back to Jacob. He was watching her with those steady eyes that had seen her at her worst and stayed anyway. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I think I'm ready." He stood slow and careful, like he was afraid of spooking her. "Ready for what?" "To be your wife, really." Something shifted in his expression, hope and fear tangled together. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He crossed the space between them and cupped her face in his hands, gentle as prayer. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this." "I know," she said, and she did. The kiss was soft and careful, both of them learning the shape of something new. When they pulled apart, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady as the land they stood on. Spring arrived with wildflowers and new calves and Grace's first laugh. The town eventually stopped talking, or maybe they just found something else to gossip about. Sarah didn't care anymore. She had a home. She had a daughter. She had a man who'd chosen her when she had nothing to offer but brokenness and need. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch and painted everything gold, Jacob found Sarah on the porch with Grace in her arms. He sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and they watched the light fade together. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me behind that livery, for making the choice you made." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand, laced their fingers together, and said, "Best decision I ever made." Grace cooed, reaching for the sunset with tiny hands like she could catch the light. Sarah pulled her close and leaned into Jacob's warmth, and for the first time since she'd started running, she felt like she'd finally arrived. The wind whispered through the grass, the cattle lowed in the distance, and the three of them sat together on the porch of the White House, building a life from the ashes of everything they'd lost.